This was the one thing about him being in the Byrds and everything else like this. He kept that pretty distant from the family. And it wasn't until the first album actually was printed and came out that I knew, and that most of us knew, that he was in a group called the Byrds, because he sent some copies of the album home and stuff like this. And didn't really understand the magnitude of that at all. As far as we knew, he was with another band, It was a little different deal. And being being a youngster of that era, teenager of that era, I knew all the bands of the time. I knew what was basically on the top 40 and everything else like this. And I was kind of taken back, as we hadn't heard anything about this. And I got a hold of him and talked to him, and he says, he didn't make any real big deal out of it, He says, this is just what we're doing now. I had no idea to what am I looking for a word? I guess heights of fame that he had risen to by that time.
It was just kind of interesting to see how these guys are making this transition from kind of folk music and New Christy Minstrels, Kingston Trio, and stuff of that nature to popular music. This whole kind of folk rock, kind of flower power hippie scene that was coming on at the time. And his music was quite a bit different. I remember when I heard the first album that the Byrds put out, when I heard a song that was it was just sonically totally different. It was ethereal, but at the same time it was ethereal. It was masculine and exciting on a different level, and it kind of smoldered. He had kind of smoldering quality to it. Then the other stuff was kind of light and bright and poppy, and it was good, but it wasn't something that I really connected to all that much. His music I connected to.
When you put a group together, you don't know if it's going to be an up or a down, a hit or a miss, but they loved the way they sounded, and they had a great. Roger had this wonderful format of music that he had researched out, a lot of Woody Guthrie stuff and Pete Seeger stuff, and then he'd written a few things himself, and then Gene, I had no idea Gene was such a great songwriter. I don't think he knew it either. You don't know you're going to be a great. You just things happen and you experience things and you write them down, and then even when you record them, you don't know if it's going to be accepted as a big song or not.
What's the initial success of the Byrds? If you look at some of the videos, like the Tammy show, the TNT show, whatever, you see Gene very happy to be on stage. He's looking at the little girls who are screaming, and he's smiling. He's thinking, this is really cool, as is David Crosby. And we're all very happy with the initial success of the Byrds. But as it went on, I think he became more tense on stage. He became more uncomfortable as a performer, and it wasn't as much fun for him.
Had they continued on, I think that would have Gene would have probably come forward a little bit more and been more equal to Roger. But I don't think he was interested after they became famous. It seemed like he sort of backed off, as he always did, in his entire career. So I never thought that he met his full possibilities. Never were realized with that group, for whatever reason.
When we first started working as Byrds, he was all enthusiastic to be in the music business, and I guess as it wore on, he became disillusioned with it, because it is a very tough way to make a living.
It was so crazy. Well, so crazy, in the business in those days, it was before there were any guidelines, like no one would get, you could. Gene flipped a table over in a restaurant one night, and came and set it back up and said they were sorry. I mean, you know, it was like, it was who you were. You could do no wrong. You know, I was like preparing to go to jail, and they said, "Oh, we're so sorry. You flipped the table over and set it back up, brought us all our food back." I mean, you know, those were the days when, you know, there weren't a million celebrities. There was the Byrds, the Beatles, and the Rolling Stones. That was about it. So, you know. Yeah, and he was one of them, so he could do no wrong.
He writes this great song, and Dixon, to his credit, Jim Dixon, we set up a shoot in Malibu on the beach, 16 millimeter camera. We're going to send this over, footage with a song. First video concept to Top of the Pops. Well, anyway, David got a little restless, didn't want to be there, and so David starts working on Michael. Back to my group, Chaos. Let's get out of here. This is stupid. Yeah, okay. So Michael's going for it. And then they start to leave. And Dixon, who's a reactionary, goes nuts and grabs David or does something. And then Gene comes over, who's the big guy. Gene off the farm was muscular. I mean, he comes over and grabs Dixon and holds him. And I mean, I'm going, oh, my God. And I said, Roger and I are standing here. I said to Barry Feinstein, shoot this. Keep the camera going. This is the video. And didn't go for that. So, but it was such a great idea, and we goofed it up. So that was what I meant. It wasn't dark, drug, alcohol things that dismantled the Byrds. It was stupidity. There we are with this opportunity to go and send this over to England to be played on television. A video. No one had done this before. And we messed it up. Gone. Forever.
Now, there's another approach to why he left the Byrds. And you were going to ask me about this, but I'll just tell you. We went to visit Jim Dixon in the hospital when he was quite ill. And in fact, I think he thought he might not survive. And Jim told us that it was Eddie Tickner and Jim's intention to spin Gene off as kind of an Elvis Presley, as a solo artist, and leave the rest of the Byrds as the Byrds. So Gene they'd have double their money and double their fun, right? They'd have an Elvis Presley and the Byrds. And that was what Dixon told us. He later recanted it after he got well, but that was the story. And I believed it at the time. I'd never thought of that. I really thought it was just Gene's fear of flying that was the reason he left.
He just wanted to make music. He just wanted to be Gene. I think somebody whispered in his ear that he was really the star of the Byrds, and that he, being by far the best looking one of us, could make it on his own as a solo career easily. I think that had been whispered in his ear.
The original group of people, and you're all sort of reaching for the brass ring together. Or my analogy was you're all painting the Mona Lisa smile together. When one of them leaves, or it's part of the essence is diminished, it's never quite the same, but it is still valid. So in our case, we made good records without Gene. I still miss Bill Wyman in the Rolling Stones, because Bill had something there, as subtle as it was with Charlie. And the Stones are wonderful. But when Bill left, it was never the same. And I think that applies to a lot of different things in the artistic world, you know, when you're working with other people. So when he left, yeah, we lost a good part.
The Dorden Clark expedition, I guess, was really the first time that I got to see him away from the Byrds. And I was pretty amazed by what they were doing, because they were actually ahead of what the Byrds were doing with country music. He was kind of there before the Byrds were, and even though he didn't have a part in making the Byrds go country, I don't know, maybe he did, maybe he did, it wasn't so obvious. Maybe it was just less obvious, but I think they were all headed in that country direction and they didn't really even realize it themselves. I think something was just bringing them there. Unfortunately for all of them, it was a little too early,
And then we got back together again to make the reunion album, and I completely screwed it up. Because in the meantime, you gotta understand, like, when they threw me out, Chris and Roger, their parting line was, "We'll do better without you." Then comes Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Then comes Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. Then we walk into a room, try to do a reunion, And I had too big an ego. And I wanted to produce. I wanted to probably wanted to get back at Roger for being the boss all the time before. Childish shit.
The individual Byrds never had settled who owns the name. And so Gene hired an attorney, said, I want to use this name and I don't want to have any problems with it. So one thing led to another, and it's the typical legal fight of Gene's going out as the Byrds with Michael playing drums, and it's not the Byrds, it's a variation of the Byrds. But the original Byrds, nor their producers, none of them ever registered the name at that point in time. So Gene gets a letter back from one of his attorneys that says basically he won in court, which a lot of people don't know. He won in court. But the scuttlebutt was he was a lesser Byrd of the Byrds. He was the lesser Byrd because he left earlier. So he wasn't entitled to claim the name. So Gene came up with this very funny thing. He says, Sloke, I'm changing my name to Lester Byrd. So if you get a call from Lester, it's me, Lester Byrd.
I think he was glad to be with the guys. He adored Roger. Absolutely put him up on a pedestal like a lot of people wouldn't believe. And Chris was his buddy. He really enjoyed Chris's company. And Michael was his bud. I mean, he broke Michael's leg, I think, one time by accident. They were horsing around in the house. And Crosby, I don't think that they ever really... There was this competitiveness. I think people always felt it was Roger and Gene that were competitive. I think it was Crosby and Gene that were competitive.
He would do things about his Byrd days. Occasionally, he'd say, listen, Slope, we're going. There's a place north of Mendocino called Fort Bragg. Fort Bragg is all loggers. Hard-working guys, break their back to make whatever they make an hour. And this is 30, almost 40 years ago. So he comes over to Tommy K's house at 11 o'clock. He says, Slope, get up. I want to go to Fort Bragg. And I said, oh, Gino, what are we doing? He says, I want to go test my Byrdness. I keep saying, burden? So we went to a diner in Fort Bragg, and he's got this old military green, American green military long trench coat on with cowboy boots. So the check comes. This is after 2.5 hours. He goes up to pay the check. He says, remember me? I was in the Byrds. And he takes his jacket off. And he's just wearing his his sleeping pants. And that's it. And his boots. So it was like, And he says to the girl, "Don't you know who I am? I'm Gene Clark. I was in the Byrds." He says, "I don't know who you are, and I don't care. Pay my bill."
He was a great poet, singer, picker. If you could just sit in the room here while he played the guitar, you know, you'd just be transfixed. He was really good. His dad, like I say, was a earth mover, you know, golf course builder and such. And he, in the middle of the night, you know, his buddies would be over and they'd need another guitar. And he'd wake Gene up, just a kid, you know, "Come on, sit in with us. Put that in it. Don't forget that. That's really cute." They'd have him sit in with us. So he learned it from his father at a very early age and his father's friends. And that's why it's kind of hillbilly influence, you know, country hillbilly influence.
Gene was exposed to several different kinds of music and endeavors at that time. And the main one, I think, that really helped hone his voice and everything like that was he was a member of the Bishop's Choir. And the Bishop's Choir, Archdiocese Choir, was required to perform at such things as ordinations and stuff like this. And Gene did this for quite a few years when he was younger. And some people might think, Gene Clark in the Bishop's Choir, that doesn't hardly fit. But in fact, it was. He had a very clear voice, very, very, almost alto. The bishop was an old Irishman, and he loved that high lilting voice. And he would give Gene special parts in the chorus, you know, so that even in the midst of it, you could hear that voice. Excuse me. But that was really where I think his voice training really got honed into place.
I saw him as kind of a country boy. It's a little like, it's kind of a John Wayne character, you know, honest as the day is long and kind-hearted, gentle soul, and a good musician, a good singer, and a good songwriter, very good songwriter. I'd had some experience writing songs in the Brill Building in New York, so I'd had a little more professional background in it, but he had a natural talent for writing songs, and the two of us wrote songs easily.
His songwriting would just grow and grow. Went from sort of Beatlesque Liverpool tunes initially, and then all of a sudden he's writing these "Set You Free" this time, things like that, which were way beyond. In a matter of months, he grew intellectually in songwriting.
He listened. He listened to everything around him. He listened to me, he listened to Roger, he listened to the other bands that were started to happen. When we started, that was it. It was us and the Beatles. But he started listening to the stuff that we listened to. I listened to jazz. He thought that was crazy. But he didn't think Everly Brothers was crazy. He got that. Roger listened to folk music. Gene got that. He got that strongly. And that affected him, too. He grew. He was growing.
I never thought of him as a musician in the same fashion that I thought of others. His guitar playing seemed to be only a medium. Didn't seem to be of any particular interest other than as a medium to this melody, a support to the melody and the words. And he never seemed to really care whether or not that. I mean, of all the places a musician might deign to go, to arrive to get from one place to another, that wasn't of any particular interest at all. These two chords are fine, but obviously the poetry was of great value,
Gene basically really played with the same kind of the same chordal structure, very simple chordal structure, with always a little sense of surprise, something a little different in that same chordal structure, and then he always had these wonderful lyrical visions, and so his lyrics were always unique. I mean, look at you just said the titles of the songs. You know, the titles of the songs were unique, and the way he said things were. You know, I always wondered whether or not they were country speak because I didn't grow up in that part of the country, or whether or not they were something that came out of Gene, that they were unique to Gene. But I think Gene had one of the more unique voices lyrically, and I don't know anybody else who wrote like that.
He would just sit slumped on the couch and just start playing something of some sort of feeling. I always thought that they were all too slow until the end of the song. And all of a sudden, oh my God, that's just gorgeous. And watching the poetry occur was not really that monumental at the time. I wouldn't say, oh, what's he going to say next? It wasn't any of that bullshit. It's just what all of a sudden sense would be sense in a style not unlike a haiku poem.
Once he was writing and he was on a flow, he loved it. He was just almost like a drug, like high, you know, and it would, you know, he would be, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? And, you know, and play it. And does this sound better than this? And, you know, and he would be completely taken on another level when he was, you know, when it was flowing. We had a parlor. Were you in the parlor where it had the fireplace and you could look out on the ocean, on the orchard? We had a round oak table just like that one at that window, and there was a little fireplace in that room. It was an old parlor with the eave where the stairs went up, and he'd sit at that table and write with the fire on, and it was right off the kitchen, so he could hear. You know, I'd be putzing around in the house, and he'd be in there writing, and he always wrote right at that table and have his guitar stand right there, and not comfortable necessarily, or the biggest room in the house, or the most acoustically perfect, but that's where he wrote.
Gene was a workhorse. When he wanted to sit down and write, like with Pat, boy, they would write to finish. You know, some people will go, oh, here's a bridge, here's a chorus, or here's something, can you finish it? Or he would start with his spiral notebook. If he had a spiral, usually he worked in a spiral notebook with a pencil, and then or a pen, and he would write lyrics, and they would sit and hash out the chords and hash out the song. And then every once in a while, he'd turn up with something like Your Fire Burning, which was totally from some deep inner part of him that, and you can feel it and you can tell it in his singing. And there's pain in that song, and a couple of other songs he had that were like that, that were, you could tell were real fleshing out of, you know, of pain.
When he was focused, he wanted to do the best job as an artist, songwriter, as a craftsperson, because the art of learning how to write songs he was into. And he also was into being a storyteller. And that's a lot. You know, a lot of guys would just, you know, would have folded after 1968 or 69. They'd say, I made it. I did it. I'm going to become a movie star, or I'm going to do this, blah, blah, blah. He stuck with it, you know.
As a singer, nobody sounds like Gene Clark. He's like Percy Sledge. When you hear the voice, you immediately know it's Gene Clark. Unless he's putting his Elvis impersonation on, which then he kind of sounds like Elvis. But as a writer, no one could touch him. Nobody. He was pretty close to being one of the best folk rock writers of everybody. I mean, including Dylan. I think he really had a beauty in his writing, that just nobody else could really capture that. And as far as a performer, he was up there with the best. I mean, I would say that the Beatles thought the Byrds were just brilliant. I mean, and it certainly was a collective brilliance. But I think Gene was somewhat ahead of the pack, and I don't say that just because, I knew him. I just think that in retrospect, you hear him in the Byrd songs. If you know Gene's writing and you know his chord patterns and his style of writing, you hear it in all the songs. 8 Miles High is Gene Clark. I mean, it's 99.9% Gene Clark. The guitar solos, Roger, and a couple lyrics, David put in. I mean, that's my feeling. You hear his writing in so many young bands that will sample his writing, like You Showed Me, that he wrote, the Turtles recorded, that signature Gene Clark sort of sad minor chord to major chord. It's brilliance.
Gene was a consummate professionalist when he was in the studio. He was very, very picky about the outcome of it and everything else. He stayed on top of the work in the studio. He did not like anything outside of the studio as far as performing and stuff like that. If he felt like performing, he could do a great job. But if he didn't feel like it, don't bother him with it, But because every time he'd go into a studio, that seemed to close in around him and shelter him, and that allowed him to express himself in the way he wanted to. And I think that's why, under all the circumstances through his life, no matter what his personal level was at the time, his performances in the studio and the things that he did were always top shelf.
The state of mind in the studio was all focused on making music. There was nothing flippant or silly about the sessions. It was very focused and very professional, and everybody worked their asses off on it. It's important. This is everybody's careers. And I think all the guys felt that way, and Tommy and Gene felt that way. I mean, we stayed very focused and worked on songs, because for the most part, it's as much as people would like to think of it as this real insane backstage kind of vibe that, they all read about in random notes and in the Enquirer or whatever. It's a hard-working professional atmosphere in the studio. I mean, there's a lot of money being spent, there's careers on the line, there's a lot involved in it. So when everybody walks in that door, 99.9% of the time they're focused and you're making the best music you can.
The No Other album, he put everything into that. Everything. Heart, soul, money, everything he had, he poured into that thing. Because that was going to be his reclamation, And when they killed it, it killed him, almost professionally. I was real surprised to see how well he came back out with the Two Sides to Every Story after what he went down. He really felt like he had been shafted, and shafted badly, that he knew his work was good. A lot of people knew his work was good. People even helped talk him out of the Byrds because they thought he was better than the rest of them. Very big, important people at that juncture. So he felt that people had misled him, that he had been robbed, cheated, lied to,
In Hollywood, if you have an altercation with a David Geffen, or you have an altercation with a big booking agent or somebody who has a lot of power, most of the time you're done. And when I and Dixon and Eddie Tickner and Andy Candanis decided we were going to try to, it's a terrible word, rehabilitate his career. Dixon took care of him, fed him. This is before he got the house. We started doing the Firebird album, or This Bird Has Flown album, excuse me while I take a sip. People would come up and say, "Oh man, Gene Clark is great, but he's nuts." And no, he wasn't nuts. He just had some issues, that's for sure. But he wasn't nuts like Joe Meek or. There was a reasonable assumption that they could pull off a deal with a major. And everybody tried. Eddie went to Warner Brothers, back to Columbia, and so on and so forth. We couldn't get anybody. They wouldn't touch him.
The only great business decision Gene Clark ever made was being a great songwriter. And everything else, he was like some kind of, minstrel or poet, and he had no relationship to business whatsoever. I can't imagine Gene Clark being in a room with a businessman, a record company person, to discuss a plan, even a marketing plan, even a creative plan for a record of his. And I certainly couldn't imagine him, and again, this is just coming to me as we're talking, him in a suit, with a pad of paper with some ideas and taking notes on how we're going to promote and publicize and market this project. It's just so, there are some very utilitarian musicians. There are some people who are very sharp, like Mick Jagger, let's say, and supremely talented. And then there's people that are a lot more, don't hurt me, Mick, but are just simply the artist and don't have that within them whatsoever. And I guess that was Gene. And this is really kind of coming to me as we're talking about this, is that maybe is the thing. He was simply a pure artist, and the other stuff wasn't of any consequence to him whatsoever.
I think he's right up there with the greats, and I don't think he's ever been given his due for that. He has by other musicians, but I don't think he really was able to bring to the public what he was really all about, as a singer-songwriter. Like all those songs nobody's ever heard. There's probably a treasure trove of stuff. I don't know if we'll ever hear that stuff, but I know his peers all recognize that in Gene, and he was the one everybody always talked about, as far as the writer and the singer. Of course, Crosby was talked about because he had the great high harmonies and could play a good rhythm guitar, but as a person, he didn't have the depth that Gene did. Gene just had this amazing depth to him that none of the other guys had.
He was at least a triple threat because of his great voice, his great melodies, which are stunning, and his lyrical content, because none of us can figure out with his limited education where his vocabulary, his lyrical vocabulary came from. It's just stunning.
I'd try to get him to read this or that, but he wouldn't. He'd look at a book, but he wouldn't. He just wasn't interested in reading, which is another interesting aspect of him and his work, because, there's some great poetry there he did, and usually a poet is influenced by other poets. That's a turn on that they have, and I never caught him with a book. He understood things. He had an intuitive knowledge of the way things worked. Kind of a 3D mind. He could, he was wise beyond his years.
It's incredible that, somebody like him would get lost in a shovel, because it's just so, to me, the music was so beautiful, but he just didn't have, I don't know if he had this kind of flash that they were looking for. I think he was a lot more, a reliable, durable, homespun type of person, He just didn't do the flash thing.
As the years go by, and I keep hearing things about Gene Clark that I didn't know about when he was alive, and I hear the songs that he wrote and the different things that he did artistically, I mean, I'm amazed. I didn't know that when he was alive. I didn't know that he was such a great songwriter. You know, it's kind of like George Harrison. I didn't know George was such a great songwriter because he didn't sell himself that much. You know, he didn't do that much personal PR to make himself visible. And Gene didn't do that. He didn't sell himself. He was kind of quiet in the background. And so you didn't think he was doing anything. But then after he's gone and you see this body of work that he's done, then you go, oh man, incredible.
Gene had an incredible imagination, and it just grew as time went on. He would think up the darndest things to do, you know. I mean, he would really come up with some of the stuff was pretty wacky. I remember in particular one time, the Boy Scouts had a camporee, and they were in competition. His troop was in competition with another troop of Boy Scouts. Well, they lost the obstacle course into that. That really upset Gene, and he went out and he built out of everything he could find, and I got involved with the construction. Believe me, he drugged me along with it. He built an obstacle course, and then he had his platoon that he was in Scouts with come over to our house and train and train and train, so they never got beat again.
As time went on, we more or less grew from the childhood to a little bit more teenager to a little bit more adult as time went on. I got out of his shyness in a way, hanging around us, because we were always wild and more wild than we should have been. But we showed Gene a good time, and he more or less got into that good time. We drank too much at teenagers and stuff like that, which I think every teenager back then did. And as far as I know, is Gene snapped out of his shell from being a shy person to a normal person.
He had an alcohol problem before he left. He was drinking pretty heavily before he left home. In fact, I witnessed a very unfortunate incident when I was home on leave one time, that we went out with a bunch of his buddies, and I ended up having to drag him out of a public restaurant because he was about to pick a fight with football coach. And so he had the problem, at least with alcohol. And there's, addictive problems throughout the family. It goes back to my grandfather at least, and probably further.
I was rowdy, my dad was rowdy. We were rowdy guys, we have some Native American in us, a little firewater in us, and we're gonna get a little nuts, and get in trouble. They don't want you to be, doing that stuff.
Well, I'm not exactly positive of what exact blood and bloodlines come, but there is definitely Native American in our bloodline on the Clark family, and Dad very much so was into that part of spirituality, and I think because he didn't find a lot in the church growing up, or each individual is different, and we find different spiritual enlightenment, whether it's through a church or through nature or whatever it may be, or music or what have you. Dad found it in his Native American roots, and I think the people he found he related to strongest were spiritual advisors of Native American spiritual advisors, and so on and so forth. His house was very much decorated in southwestern Native American memorabilia and stuff like that. So he was very into it and very spiritual in that sense. And he had a fascination with ravens, and I'm not sure if it was really his totem or not, but he had this fascination with ravens, and believed it was his spiritual guide. And
like I said, we used to pretend that we could speak Native American, and he was aware. He was aware, for some reason, more than anybody else, of our heritage in that. In fact, when he was talking to me of that St. Patrick's Day, he said, "Do you remember when we used to run around in the woods and pretend that we could speak Native American?" He said, "That was our ancestors speaking through us." So
it was fun to always be around Doug Dillard because he and Gene were hilarious. They could have been a comedy team as well as a bluegrass team. They were hilarious. So we were living, Gene and I were in LA, and he was recording, and we had rented a huge house that supposedly used to be the Jackson 5 house up on Queens Road up above the Strip in LA. And whenever we were in LA, Doug Dillard would always come and visit and stuff, and they were drinking more, and it got crazier and crazier, and I finally said, "Listen, I'm leaving you two in LA," and so Gene could finish his album, and I said, "I'm going to go back to Mendocino," which I did. Well, that was like giving two 12-year-olds full reign of the house and anything, toys and candy they wanted. And so they and they played some incredible bluegrass music together. It wasn't just, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but, it was that too. So anyway, I guess they'd been up for 3 days and been really having a great old time, and I think most people know if you stay up for days at a time, paranoia is one of the things that sets in. So I guess they were, it was an hour after sunrise, and all of a sudden they heard over a loudspeaker, a bullhorn, "The house is surrounded. Come out with your hands up." Well, both of them dropped to the ground, started crawling around the house madly, trying to find every drug that was in the house and flushing them down the toilet and saying, "We got to straighten up. We got to straighten up," And there I heard it again. "The house is surrounded. Come out with your hands up." And they'll shoot us. They'll see us and they'll shoot us. And so they crawled around and freaking out. And finally, they decided that they'd have to surrender. So they got a pair of white boxer shorts of Doug's, tied them onto the broom handle, and stuck it out the window and started waving it, surrendering. And they said it again, "Come out with your hands up, surrender, come out, surrender, it must be the wrong window." So they crawled to another window and waving this out. And finally they heard, "That's a wrap," or something, and it let them know that they were filming a movie down below on the street below, and the sound was carrying up. So I think the party stopped then. Gene came home in a couple days. I scared them to death.
The two of those guys together could put away too much whiskey and too much booze. I mean, it's just ungodly, the drinking that they could do. And for the most part, it just got to the point by that time that they were just getting sloppy. They were getting too far out over the edge. And I think that John Fogerty probably summed it up as well as anything when he said that if Dillard and Clark had been more hungry at the time, the Creedence wouldn't have had a chance. They were that good.
Was Gene ambitious? I think he was ambitious to be recognized for a talented writer and performer. I don't think having a big house was important to him. I think being well-dressed, eating well, having the basics were important, but beyond that, there wasn't much important to him that I'm aware of. He wasn't a show-off.
I was never aware that he had a lot of money, ever. That never seemed to be, until I saw the Maserati, I went, "Oh, this guy's got money." Had no idea. of the amount of money that might be coming his way. That never was a discussion. He never flaunted anything. He wore the same stuff pretty much every day, T-shirts and a leather jacket, I think, jeans. No fancy shoes, no fancy accoutrement of any sort, you know, and not a lot of hanging on women, which I found interesting. Once I saw the Maserati, I thought, oh, there must be models in evidence somewhere. I so hope he'll share them with me. Never saw them. There were a few people here and there, but they were mostly just the troubadour hangers on you.
We had to be in LA. That's where we worked. You know, that's where the factory was. You know, and we had to do our shift in order to have the house up in Mendocino County or whatever else we wanted to do. You know, that was part of it. I couldn't just go up there and have a house in LA and a house in Mendocino and just not, you know, just look at the ocean. That didn't pay very well. So. And I think Gene used it just like I did it as like a refresher, just to kind of get, you know, your batteries filled up again and come back and fight it. I may be over dramatizing it, but there was you know, we didn't think of it as being that romantic then. That, oh well, we're doing this and we're escaping and you know, it was just what we did. It was like a bolt and run. Okay, I gotta get out of here for a while, you know, and let things quiet down so. And I also don't think anybody was telling Gene what to do up there. You know, Gene didn't like to be told what to do. He was pretty strong, you know, pretty strong-headed.
Everybody liked him. I didn't hear a bad word about Gene Clark anywhere from anybody on the lot. And I'm always very aware of what people thought of our artists. You know, some artists didn't go down too well. Even though they were selling records, they didn't go down too well with the folks that were working for them. But I never heard a bad word about Gene. You know, it just didn't happen as we would have hoped it would.
One night we were at El Coyote in this Mexican restaurant somewhere in LA. I can't even remember where. But in the table across from us was Mark Hamill from Star Wars, you know, and Empire Strikes Back had just came out. Me and my brother were super excited about it, and like, oh my God, dude, there's Mark Hamill. And the guy ends up coming back to my dad's house, and they get all drunk, and they're like, you know, having this heart-to-heart, and, you know, talking all night. And I'm like, this is just the coolest thing. But my dad was really not living that. So I got to see this rock star lifestyle when he wasn't even living that style, you know. He was broke.
Gene was a really proud fellow, and in many ways, creatively, the way he dressed, the way he took care of where he lived, and you would rarely hear him say a negative word, and you never would hear him say a negative word, in particular about Roger McGuinn. There were a few people he would make fun of now and then and kid around about, but he didn't really go. He wasn't very retrospective in at least with me, and never beat himself up or was unhappy or mentioned, well, this record of mine was really great and it should have done better and someone else did better with a lesser record. He was a fan of music and a fan of other people, and would play records when he found 3 minutes that he liked, play it over and over, and wasn't really one to bitch and moan about his situation, especially in relationship to other people.
One thing I got to hand to Gene, he had disciplines in certain areas. That was one of the only one time I saw him after, I think it was after McGuinn, Clark, and Hillman. He'd been doing bad drugs, and he put on weight. I never saw a pot belly on him. He had a pot belly. Well, he straightened up. The next time I saw him, he was down in L.A., living in the Valley. And, man, the guy was like, he'd do this thing. He'd just get himself into shape. He'd do like 150 sit-ups and 150 push-ups. He goes, look at this. And he jumps on the floor. He's going, he's doing these push-ups, man. And, I mean, he had, before it was in style, he had those, the wash tub, washboard stomach and everything. I mean, the guy was in shape. He did stay in shape. He was a strong guy physically. But even that he didn't. He wasn't a scrapper. He probably could have been a really nasty bad guy. If he really wanted to fight and everything. But he wasn't a fighter. Wasn't in him. He was a real loving kind of guy. I mean, honestly, he was a good guy. I mean, maybe I'm ruining an image here. Maybe people want him to be something else.
There was a manliness about him. There was a square, straight shooter ness about him, particularly when he was, I guess, sober is a word I would have to use. But when he was comfortable with himself, in himself, which he was a great much of the time, equally so as showing discomfort with himself. But often he would just be very regular and just like a neighbor, just a very comfortable, pleasant, grounded. Grounded is the word I'm looking for. He would be very grounded and really look you right in the eye, and really quite happy and quite regular, and say regular things, and not clouded, not looking askance, not looking aside, and having something else going on when you're having a conversation with him, which also occurred. But he was just a jewel, and I was so happy he wasn't like that all the time, because he never wrote in those periods of time. But I'm sorry about his angst, but I'm glad that we have the result.
I was a kid trying to learn how to play the guitar, and I feel a whole lot better, the single of the 45, and I remember putting it on, trying to learn how to learn the song words, and I was just a little kid trying to, and so it was really amazing to me to meet him, because he was such a, to me, an iconic figure for me, and a towering figure because of his voice, and the fact that he wrote the song, and the fact it was a million seller, and it was a huge influence on me, bigger than I realized, So it was great fun to actually play that song with him for the first time,
Gene had soul. He just did. You walked up to him, you met him, you shook his hand, you liked him. He was handsome. He was a good-looking man. Girls loved him.
My mom always said it's a poor dog that doesn't wag his own tail. And I think Gene was kind of like that. He didn't wag his own tail much. Maybe he had a self-image problem. I think he kind of did. He really didn't know how beautiful he was. He didn't know what a gift his talent was to the rest of us.
He was ambitious in his songwriting. I don't know that he ever wanted to be a pop star. I know he liked the money that came with it and the girls. But after that, I really don't. I don't know if he could have dealt with success. The failure of some of the records that came later didn't seem to bother him, and I think the success would have not bothered him either. I don't think he was bothered. Period. I just think he wanted to come in and make his music as well as he could, and he was happy to be done with it.
I've been in the music business 40 years, and why Gene didn't have the recognition and success, maybe I've worked with a lot of people through these 40 years that a lot of them don't really, success sometimes scares them. And I don't know if that was Gene's case or not, but I know that you have to take advantage of opportunities, and you can't, burn bridges and whatever. I don't know if he did that or not, but if you're not ready for it, and basically, a lot of singers and songwriters shoot themselves in the foot. They don't want it to happen. They'll do anything. They say they do, but they'll do anything to make it not happen. And, I don't know why that is. I don't know if that's self-destructive, a self-destructive nature.
As far as accepting how to deal with success, I think Gene failed at that. But, he was knew he was fortunate, but he knew he had something very unique. Therefore, very often, you would see him kind of get bored with something, and he would kind of want to change it up a bit. He liked to change it up a little bit. I was lucky he never walked away from what we did together, and we always were in touch, and we would always do something together, whether it was sing, do a gig, or I would come up and sit in. There was always some communication, but I did notice that in his the bands that he had through the years, whether it was McGuinn Clark Hillman or it was the thing with Doug Dillard or whatever he had going on, changing up the players. And there was very often, he was the guy that left. And I think a lot of it was that he brought the seed of a beautiful idea. And then as that would flower, it seemed to not be the flower he expected it to be, so he would go elsewhere.
I think that there was a discomfort about what the future of the band could be. And so there were a lot of changes after the second album, after that first tour to Chicago. There were a lot of changes of people, and John Cornell finally came in, and various other players were surrounding it, and it became more of a bigger deal, and yet Gene never seemed to take on the role of star or central figure. Maybe I wonder if that's a clue. Maybe you'll find out in future stuff if you don't know already. Maybe he was reluctant to be the central figure on every level, because he certainly seemed to be up to the before the making of the second album, when it started getting funny. And that's when it really got funny, but it didn't matter before that, whether or not he was the central figure.
It's quite common that for talented people, when they get close to that success, they're so frightened by it that they self-destruct because they don't want it. It's terrifying. It's terrifying. If you're a person, like if you read Bob Dylan's Chronicles book, he was focused. He knew what he wanted. He wanted success. So he wasn't afraid of it. He welcomed it. But I think there are a lot of people, and Gene is an excellent example here, where you love the music and you love performing and you love songwriting, and all of a sudden these people are treating you like you're some kind of demigod. It's terrifying, and then you have a great night, and then the next night you have a terrible night, and you think, uh-oh, what's going to happen the third night? Am I going to have a great night? Am I going to have a wonderful night? All these people are relying on me to be wonderful. All these people are relying on me to be talented and charismatic, and it is terrifying.
Some nights, there was a night in Dallas that Roger and I just got up and walked off the stage. We couldn't do anything. So, and that's so painful, man, because what a lovable dude. God. He really was. We really cared about him, and he was freaking me out with his music. I hadn't come across someone quite that crazy and poetic all at the same time. To me, it was as hard as it got. It was a privilege to work with him.
He was a gentleman beyond gentleman. He was a very, very well-mannered, genteel person. There were nights, obviously, where he probably, for lack of better word, his muses tortured him, which I think is one of the things what attracts all of us to performers like Gene and writers is the muse, which gives them that creativity, is also what destroys them very often, and that I think was probably something that troubled him through his life. But of course, we all respected him as the best writer in the Byrds. We thought he was the best writer and the most prolific writer. I don't know. As a man, he was a very sweet man. A very sweet man.
Anybody that can sing like that can also hear like that. If they can do those kinds of things that he can do, they can hear those things. And those are deeper things, that which makes you, understand things and differently than a lot of people or most people. You see somebody like Judy Garland or something. They're geniuses, because of their whatever their deal is, they pull it out of the universe and they're able to transport it through them in a way that nobody else can do, So that's the best of that's what I remember about him, and that's what I loved about him. And he was a good person, People, he wasn't a demon at all. He could get pissed off, and he could be, I just remember losing his temper once when he was in 1980, and he didn't want to mess with the guy, but it wasn't like that, It wasn't like that with him ever for me. He was always a gentleman, a pure gentleman, and a beautiful guy who loved music and just wanted to do that more than anything. And the rest of it, he could have done without. He probably should have stayed in Missouri, But of course he couldn't,
When he was back for the Byrds reunion, and he just walks up to me. I mean, he's just all butter. I mean, he's just my loving brother. And he walks up to me and, "How are you, kid?" and gives me a great big hug. And he was obviously really glad to see me. And I hadn't seen that in him for years. So that's one of the best memories of him as a grown man. He was, for the first time that I could tell, comfortable on stage. He liked the people around him. He actually brought them to meet Mom and Dad. He never brought any of the Byrds to the house to meet Mom and Dad, but he brought the people from the Byrds reunion to the house to meet the folks. And that was the time that I thought he was doing really well, just right in that period. But the thing is he comes out, he's all warm and everything, and I said, just being big, sis, I said, "Hey, you missed a bet not playing Kansas City Southern," and his mood just went off again.
If you're basically a country person at heart, a man's word is his word, and these things really, after a while, are really, I think Gene had a great distrust of a lot of people from that standpoint, a distrust of the business that supported him and of his workplace. But then once he had the success, then the distrust of the the people trying to get something from you and wanting to be around the star.
Shit. Music business could eat a Tyrannosaurus Rex and not even burp. Music business is a horrible, horrible, horrible mess. Full of people you wouldn't let in your house. He was unhappy. A couple of times that I saw him. Wasn't exactly a happy dude. I think he thought that he could have been much more successful than he was. And it's possible that he could be. I don't know who was managing him. I don't know what career moves he made. I know he had talent.
I truly believe that, for all the gift he had, that there was another side of it that was dark, that he didn't know where it was coming from, if it would ever come again, why him, what did he do to deserve this? There was that whole side of it, and I think it took him to the peak of insanity many times, just not understanding, having no concept at all. And also, for all the inspiration that went through him, but never that he experienced that, that knowledge, in his own life. He was a suffering soul, except for when we were, at the farm with the kids, and But, you know, basically, Gene was not a happy man when he was in his head because he just didn't understand.
There were times when the turning a job into a fiasco, that seemed to be important on some sort of a level periodically. And it wouldn't be consistent, but all of a sudden it would just turn into a disaster. Why? What is this benefiting? What are we doing here? Well, I couldn't ever find any particular. It wasn't anger at the press or anger at the audience or anger at the club or any of that. It didn't seem to be related to anything in particular. All of a sudden, he would just do something that was just untoward, uncomfortable. It was really, it wasn't always, it never was vicious or any of those kind of words. It was never anger pointed at anybody. It always seemed to be angry at him, some sort of anger or angst related to his own life.
You know, from meeting my grandma and grandpa and my relatives out there, they were poor. I mean, real poor. And, you know, if there's 13 mouths to feed, they were all hard workers, but, you know, it's a huge family to take care of, you know. So I think when he always had you know, well, he was older, so he probably got, but, you know, there was always hardships. I think there was years that they were hungry, you know. And so I think when my dad got money, it was like, you know, he could have whatever he wanted, and the excesses got kind of out of control.
Well, Gene always wanted to have a band, but then he'd always be tempted by any opportunity to become a huge star, and he'd always thought, yeah, you know, an Elvis Presley kind of guy, you know. So we'd look at each other and go, well, now what are we doing here? You know, John York and I laugh about that. He's just, you know, he was all over the place, you know, but he was, you know, just wanted to do the right thing. He thought he was a star, and he was, you know. But it's just that, you know, a lot more responsibility has to be taken for your position, you know. And he was a little wild.
That was his big challenge, because I kind of think he had difficulty balancing the interaction about who he was and what his core was against the LA star maker machinery, in the words of Johnny Mitchell. I think he found it so innocuous, but at the same time, you know, they were the paying customers, right? But the lifestyle was, he would go between, you know, driving his old beat-up car in Mendocino to be driving a Porsche or a Ferrari around Hollywood for a while. Then he ended up with an old Pinto. So he straddled the extremes. In his work, he was passionate and he wanted to do it right. And I think the trappings of success are, I think, for him, are pretty superficial, but he, you know, sometimes he got seduced by it.
I just don't think anybody that becomes super famous is a normal person in any respect. I think their talent, I think in some cases, and this may sound negative, but I think it's you almost sacrifice your life to do that, because you just totally pull yourself out of any kind of normalcy. That's not a normal life. And especially when I'd worked with so many, you know, I mean, my friends and people, whether it was the Roy Orbisons or the Waylon Jennings or the Beatles or just all these different people over the years, whether it was Andy Williams or David Cass, people who had achieved superstardom, that's a whole different, that's, you know, very rarefied air. And it's just a different, unique kind of person that can come to that level.